Hey, Jennifer, Tommy Gibbons here, professor of the course. Welcome. Great to have you. And thank you for what you've written here in both of the response forums in week one. Besides everything else, the writing is really beautiful and a delight to read. So thank you for the effort that you've put into that. And I thought I'd send you a reply video. It gives me a chance to say hello this way, a little bit more directly and also kind of get our conversation started with some reactions to what you've written. So thank you for the good work that you've done because what you've written is great. Love what you have highlighted in the first forum dealing with how Paul is using Habakkuk. Um, it's not unfortunately customary for us to kind of sink our minds into what an Old Testament book is saying when we try to make sense of how a writer like Paul in the New Testament is using a bit of it. So you've, I think, given us a little bit more to go on with the kind of, I don't know, destitution that Habakkuk and his generation are experiencing, the horror that the cruelty of the Chaldeans arouses in Habakkuk, is questioning God as to why God would allow something so horrifying to befall God's own people. This is the kind of cauldron in which faith emerges with some of the contours that you have drawn yourself in your response. It's a way of living that doesn't cave to cynicism, um, is not willing to exploit people, unlike the proud and the arrogant. Um, Habakkuk says it's really the word of the Lord that Habakkuk is delivering. The just by faith will live. And so faith is this pattern of life of trusting God to provide rather than manipulating others, dominating others, giving up on others in the midst of terrible circumstances. And so that then gives us something to go on for what Paul is doing with faith in his letter to the Romans. And I love how in the second forum you've sort of kind of given us a little bit of a, I don't know, we call it a semantic grid. You've just highlighted some of the key places, instances where Paul uses this key term in the opening part of the letter and begun to create a kind of sense of what its meaning is by how Paul is using the word dynamically in the letter. And that I think is actually a lot more sound when it comes to interpretation than trying to reduce faith to one supposedly stable technical definition. That's not really how words work, especially in a pastoral letter like Paul's. Um, Paul is shaping what the words mean by virtue of how Paul uses the words. And so we want to track how he's using the words in the letter as you've begun to do to make sense of what keywords mean. So great job on that. Um, I guess the only other thing I think I might highlight, well, two things in connection. So I think that it's important to note that the faith of the just in Habakkuk depends on the faith of God. It is the faith in God who will act in good faith, so that the trustworthiness or faith of God is actually the ground of the faith of the just. And that's something that I think is often missed. We sort of think of, God on one side of the fence and the human on the other. And what we're reading about in the Bible is about, some kind of contractual interaction between the two. But um, to stick with that metaphor, God is on both sides of the fence. And faith for Paul is a gift of the faith of God, so that, as he says, the justice of God is revealed from faith to faith. meaning, I think, from the faith of God, which persists until it generates the faith of the human as sort of the expression of what God's faith looks like in human beings as they grow from and in that faith. So obviously, this reaches its fullness, I would say, for Paul in the person of the Messiah, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one person. And as I think you said beautifully in a couple spots, this is a contagious life, the life of Jesus. So his embodiment of faith, you might say, is the life that is shared with others by the Spirit uh, through whom Jesus was raised from among the dead. That power of the Spirit is the spreading of Jesus's risen life among others. So that is important in relation to the second thing I want to highlight, which is that I'm pretty sympathetic with Taubes, and I want to be mindful that he's writing as a Jew here. But I always worry a little bit when we talk about Paul as being the founder of a people, as you have in the quotation here, Christianity being about some new people of God. I don't think that works very well. There might be some sense in which that is okay, but generally I find myself kind of bristling at it because um, the the movement that Paul is describing, the gospel, is all about God's faithfulness to how God has been revealed across the generations past. And so for us to imagine that this gospel is about God kind of starting over and making a brand new people, effectively disinheriting, uh, abandoning the historic people of God, of whom Paul is a part, I think that just doesn't make sense. And that's sometimes what we end up implying when we say things, and I think just the Christian tradition about the new people of God in Jesus or something. So I think it's important that whatever new thing the gospel is doing, however intense its welcome of people from among the Gentiles, it is always an expression of God's faithfulness to God's people from Abraham to the present. And that, I think, means we've got to talk about the Christian community not as being some brand new thing that God makes out of scratch, but a witness to what God is doing in faithfulness to God's promises to the historic people of Israel, and how God is doing something in this people that is, you might say, filling it with the power of welcome on a kind of eschatological scale. And that, of course, is what has brought this letter to the Romans, who are people from among the Gentiles, that Paul, as a Jewish apostle of Jesus, to is a messenger. He's sent to them to cultivate their now participation in this promised family of Abraham, with Jews like Paul and others. When we get to chapters 9 to 11, I think it'll become explicit that um, to be joined from among the Gentiles to this promised family of Abraham is not to replace or disown the Jewish members of that family that are even hostile to the audience. They're hostile to Jesus, even. That for Paul doesn't is not enough, you might say, to undo the faithfulness of God. Paul's going to say, even in chapter 3, will the unfaithfulness of some undo the faith of God to the people of God? He says, may it never be. Um, let let God be found true, even if every human being is a liar. So there's nothing that part of Israel can do to get itself disowned by God. And I think that's also going to be key to what this letter is about, and partly why Paul says that the gospel is about the power of salvation for all who have faith, for the Jew first, and then also for the Greek. So there's a sense in which the gospel is always about honoring the history of God's self-disclosure and never disowning anyone that God has gathered to God's people. Thanks for watching the video, and great to have you in the class. Appreciate your responses here. And you're welcome to reply to this video if you want, but no pressure to if you don't want to. If you don't want to reply, if you could just at least say received in the reply or something like that, so I know that the video came through and you had a chance to see it. And looking forward to more conversation with you throughout the summer. Thanks for your good work here in week 1.